Hi everyone, thanks for joining us here today, and thank you to Ari, Rain, Glory and Emma Hall for this performance that they just did, Eye on Nothing. It really, I think, set the scene or the vista for our continued discussion this afternoon, which is very much on something, which is printed matter and printed publications. I think that performance cleverly kind of problematized the issue of accessibility around and language and experience also that the design industry kind of poses, so thank you. Just a quick thank you to Melbourne Art Book Fair for enabling this discussion to happen and to the MPavilion team for hosting us today. I'm Sophie Rzepecky, the editor of Assemble Papers. To start off, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the lands of the traditional custodians of this land, the Boonwurrung Woon Wurrung and the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. And we pay respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of Victoria and across Australia. So to just give a brief introduction as to why we're here publishing, the act of making words and worlds accessible to more people, especially in relation to arts publishing. So worldwide, you may or may not know, the publishing industry has taken a really hard blow during the pandemic. Close to home, we witnessed the German multinational company Bauer Media pull out of Aotearoa overnight and kind of totally decimate the publishing sector. Around 300 people lost their jobs, and New Zealanders lost magazines that they had been being published for about 20 years. And then here in Australia, during COVID-19, writers and publishers seem to be sort of missing from government conversations with arts practitioners. So I guess I was wondering, by bringing these wonderful people here today, what does out of challenge and restriction come innovation? And this afternoon, we'll be unravelling the very broad question, what are the futures for arts publishing, how do we fund it, and why is it crucial to do so? So we have a very multidisciplinary group here today, sort of spanning design, urbanism, architecture, contemporary art, etc. We did have Bridget Caldwell-Bright also on this panel today, but she just messaged to say that she wasn't feeling well and didn't think it was appropriate to risk it given the current conditions of our lives at the moment, so she won't be with us today. So sorry about that, she apologises. I just wanted to say also that many of us are not trained editors. We somewhat fell into editing, and so kind of share a collective, I think, imposter syndrome that we're all talking about publishing today. So I might just give a quick introduction just to kick us all off. So on screen, zooming in from Aotearoa, we have Katie Kerr on my left. Who's a graphic designer, moonlighting as an editor and publisher, with Berlin-based photographer Alice Konu. She runs an intercontinental publishing platform called Gloria, and she recently published the book Dwelling in the Margins, Art Publishing in Aotearoa, which I have a copy of here. And then also on screen is Henry Oliver, who's the editor of Metro magazine and the publisher of Essential Services zine. And here in person we have Steve Mintern, who's the co-director of Multidisciplinary Design and Research Practice Office, which is a charitable non-for-profit practice run out of Melbourne, and they've been recently publishing The Politics of Public Space, which is a quarterly publication. And then Jeremy Kibel is the editor of free arts magazine Reflector magazine, which you can see on your seats as well. So just before we begin, a brief note to say we're going to try and keep this quite short and snappy. So the intention is more that this is a discussion than a traditional panel, and there'll be time for you guys to jump in at the end if you so wish. Okay, so I might kick off with the ones zooming in from Aotearoa. So Henry and Katie. Henry, I just have a two-part question for you, actually.
Sure.
So, yeah, what was the motivating factor to launch your free zine, Essential Services, during the pandemic, and what was the kind of context around launching that? And perhaps you can speak to why Britomart, a sort of development company in New Zealand, decided to fund that magazine.
I was working for Bauer at the start of our first sort of big lockdown, editing Metro, which is what I do now again. But so I was on the Zoom call where 200 and something people were essentially made redundant in 10 minutes. It was basically like later that day, just sort of sitting around in the sun thinking, what am I going to do with my life now? That I was actually talking to someone on my phone, and then my wife sent me a text and just said, make a zine. And I used to make zines when I was a teenager, and it just seemed like the perfect idea was just to take the kind of, instead of being angsty and angry about the situation, why not do something kind of positive and sort of affirmative and take action rather than dwelling in whatever negativity there is. Not that negativity was unjustified, but, it was a bad situation for many people. But, I guess that what it came down to was, I just kind of knew, and immediately I thought to myself, well, I might not ever get to make magazines again as part of my day job, but that doesn't mean I don't get to make magazines. Whether or not I make a magazine doesn't depend on the business decisions of a German multinational company. I can just do it. That's the first part. I mean, the second part was at Metro, we had been talking with someone from Britomart about republishing a series of essays they had commissioned. And basically, I had this Dropbox full of these great essays, and I just called the guy who I knew who was working there, and I thought, well, why not? That could just be like the start of this thing, is take these essays and let's find a way to get them to kind of, they had used them on the Britomart website, but that's a pretty limited audience of people that want to go to the website of a downtown precinct, And so through that came the idea that they could give me some money and, et cetera. And it's one of those things where, like, a lot of money for me is not very much money for them. And, I wanted to do something that was free to give out, but I wanted to pay people reasonably well. And basically that was the best way to do that is who has money? Well, property developers have money,
Yes. I do know.
I mean, I should say that we've done 3 issues so far. The second and third issue were sort of also funded by CNZ, Creative New Zealand, which is our sort of one of the largest public funding of the arts bodies. So that was kind of more of a mixed model.
Yeah, right. And what has been the response to the magazine, and actually how is it distributed?
Well, I mean, the response was amazing. I mean, it was one of those things where, especially the first one, because the first one came out kind of before any of the other post-Bauer publications came out. So I think we were kind of the first phoenix to rise from the ashes in a way. And, I think people were really shocked of the sort of caliber of writers that were in it and the caliber of artists. So it was really overwhelming, the amazing feedback and response from the audience. I mean, one of the things from how it was distributed online as a PDF and an ebook. I mean, I knew immediately when I just thought about what I want this thing to be, the first thing I didn't want it to be was a website and articles on a website and, be a kind of series of tabs in someone's browser. I wanted to make what I thought was kind of like a cohesive publication. And through Britomart, I could publish that on paper, but I wanted it also to exist digitally. But the idea was that if we make a PDF, then yes, people might get that PDF to read one thing, but they still have to flick through all the other stuff like you do in a magazine. It's not that thing where you have these sort of separate little bits and pieces and you can go and you want to see this artist or you want to read this essay. So it's kind of important to try and digitally replicate that kind of that thing that I loved about both reading and making magazines, so that it was a sort of cohesive publication as a whole. And so PDF, ebooks. We even tried putting it on Kindle through Amazon, and then a free print publication.
It's almost like print never dies, really.
Hopefully it won't. I mean.
So, Katie, you have an intercontinental imprint, Gloria, and I was just wondering why is the connection between sort of Berlin and Tamaki Makaurau or Auckland important to maintain? Maybe you can expand on this.
Yeah, sure. Well, to be honest, we definitely use the term intercontinental very lightheartedly because we're quite a small operation. But as I've said to the panel before, we like the idea that the word intercontinental can apply to us, but also to like a large international hotel chain. Like we can both use the same word. But even though it's a bit of a joke, the connection between Europe and Aotearoa is really important to us. Just before we came on the panel, I was reading an article and there was a quote by typographer Nat Piper, and she was saying that publishing was the abolition of distance between people. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about not only why we publish, especially in a global pandemic, but why Alice and I publish together on opposite sides of the world. It's a project we work on together, and by doing so, our friendship is strengthened, our creative partnership is strengthened. It used to be a really good excuse to go to Berlin regularly, but things have changed. But even so, I think having the publishing platform half based in Europe helps me kind of keep an international mindset around what we do, which can be a little bit hard to maintain on a small isolated island in the South Pacific. Even before COVID, New Zealand can feel like a bit of a bubble. And so it's healthy to keep our thinking kind of broader than our island community. And then I guess as well, like from a practical point of view, before COVID messed up international shipping, it enabled us to distribute our books more easily to both sides of the world. So international distribution has always been one of the biggest problems we face here in New Zealand. The cost of shipping is just astronomical. And so we were able to we had friends as book mules who would take our books to and from New Zealand and Berlin for us, and then we could send it out from Berlin, which is they still have book prices for shipping in Germany, so it was a lot cheaper to do that. Kind of allowed us to have a bigger reach, an international reach.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of questions there around sort of accessibility, really, to arts publishing as well. And I know that you've just published the book Dwelling in the Margins, which talks a lot about the sort of cottage industry of arts publishers across Aotearoa. And yeah, I guess my question there is, if arts publishing or the arts is to be accessible for all, which I think, publishing is generally a part of that, should those kind of cottage industries move closer to the mainstream, or how can we help arts publishing become more accessible? Because sometimes you have, a super short print run, or, the book kind of disappears from public view for, after a while.
Yeah, moving closer to the mainstream. I'm going to be tricky and say yes and no. I know in your own contribution to Dwelling the Margins, you kind of called for art publishers to connect more with commercial industry. And I do agree that there are benefits of doing so. It can be a really interesting experiment, and the results, as we see with essential services and with the single papers, they can work out really well, and it can be a really sort of successful partnership. But I think kind of on the flip side, it's also really important that there's a certain part of art publishing that remains on the margins. And that's kind of for two reasons, really, and both kind of border around ideas around accessibility. The first reason is kind of because it offers an alternative dialogue to mainstream publishing, which sits kind of outside of commercial constraints. So relatively speaking, traditional publishers still have a considerable control over what gets published, the process of bookmaking, with a commercial mindset of producing what sells. That's not a criticism, that's just a natural part of running a business, and that's part of what happens. But I think a lot of, particularly the smaller fringe art publishers operate on a different framework because we don't often plan to make any money from it. Like, I definitely don't make any money from what I do. But in a way that's kind of interesting because it creates an opportunity for people to engage with content and design that kind of sit outside of, capitalist constraints, if you want to call it that. And for the publisher, like, the beauty of it for me is that there's a certain freedom for me to experiment in both sort of content and design, and I can make something and put it out there into the world, and I don't have to worry about whether I'm meeting any KPIs or something like that. And I think kind of the second part is that, while it's kind of important to recognise that, like most disciplines, art publishing has been victim to colonial power systems, particularly in New Zealand. A growing number of artists and writers are kind of using the platform of publishing to give agency to marginalised voices in our community and kind of start new conversations through publishing. So often, art publishers will put out sort of fringe ideas that might not be taken up by mainstream publishing. So I think, and ways of working as well. Like, for example, there's a journal in New Zealand called Aotearoa, which is a journal of Māori art, and they publish in a way that they have this kind of traditional wānanga process, and that's how their content is formed. And so, that wouldn't necessarily work in kind of a traditional publishing framework currently, but it might open up ideas for that to be brought into the mainstream.
Yeah, right. Did you want to respond, Steve, to this idea of sitting outside of perhaps capitalistic structures?
Yeah, no worries. So I think it's really interesting, and so as Sophie mentioned, so we run a charity, so we can't take money from private capital. Like, it's a bit blurry that, but basically we're not legally allowed to. That's what makes us a charity. So everything we have to do is for the public good. So in order to sort of to fund and do this thing, we had to sort of crowdfund, and we did approach a publisher and basically got no response and no interest in that. So I think taking on from your point, it's weird where to look. Taking on from your point, I think that there needs to be this sort of publishers and people being able to put ideas out there that sit outside those power structures to critique them, because you're not going to critique your own power structure. That sort of defeats the purpose of having one. So I think sitting outside of that is really important for us, but there's obviously something for the people who don't as well.
Yeah. I guess this is a question for Henry and Jeremy as well. You both kind of publish free magazines, and so do I, to an extent. And I just was wondering, Jeremy, why was it important for you to publish something for free or have a free offering?
It's a pretty simple thing, because I've always, publishing now, we're at war with the internet, which offers mountainous amounts of free information. So this is the great question. When you publish everything, people go, well, why do you want to publish when people can gain the knowledge from the internet? But I've always treated publishing on this level, it's a project, it's an artistic thing. And I think most of the magazines that I grew up with were actually artistic statements run by artists, designers who had a vision, and they were trying to portray aspects of culture which wasn't seen before, or encompass sections of culture. And that's where I sort of see it as a kind of worthy thing, because it's about expressing what I feel and getting like-minded groups of people together to express how they see the society that they live within.
And Steve, maybe you want to just talk a little bit about why the politics of public space. I mean, you speak about, Reflector as a kind of an artwork or an extension of a practice, really. And how has the politics of public space supported your guys' practice? And is there an end to the project, maybe?
So there's so we're going to put out one more publication. So the idea that there's 4, which is sort of so just a slight bit of background. So we held public lectures in public spaces throughout the city. We've then transcribed those talks and then put them out into a quarterly publication. So the 4th one will be the rounding out of that, and it is sort of the way in which it situates. Like, it is a project within a wider practice, but it, as everyone knows, like, publishing takes a lot of time, and you don't make any money off it. And though we are a charity, we still do need to support ourselves in some way. So I think we're going to round it out, and then we can sort of start to take learnings from this and then deploy that into the other sides of our work. But we definitely see this like as a part of it's an office project. Like, it is a part of what we do, and we have sort of 4 poles of what we do. So we do built work, research, discourse, and education, and this sort of sits within all of those in a way. So it is a really important thing, and we think it's an important thing in terms of accessibility, which I think people have already spoken about as well. That there's a value to, I'm sure, the idea behind making these ideas free as well, and they're in cafes and people can just pick them up, and it allows a level of accessibility of ideas, I think, which we're trying to do. We can't make it free, but it is as cheap as possible to print it, so yeah.
And it's been like extremely successful. I think it sells out in the first moment that you kind of...
Not that successful.
No? Maybe that's a mythology.
You can still buy them, it's okay.
Yeah. All right. Okay, great. Yeah. I guess like a larger sort of like broader question that I'd like to ask to all of you, and maybe we can start with Oliver perhaps, is like, we've been through a really difficult time, I guess, in terms of publishing, and publications come and they go, and I think like the longevity of storytelling and stories is also a kind of a tricky one to think about. But what do you think are the sort of futures of publishing past, after the year that we've had? What do you foresee, the next sort of 5 to 10 years looking like?
Well, I wish I knew. I guess, I don't know. I think there is, we are heading towards a kind of media landscape in general of, the huge and the tiny. And, you kind of, I think, both from a sort of financial sense, but also from an audience sense, to make things work now, it seems to me like you really need to have something that is for everyone, or you have something that means an incredible amount to a reasonably small amount of people, but obviously enough people to make it sustainable. And I think that kind of feeds into, slightly connects back to what we're talking about paying. I think one of the things is, over the last year, I've worked on free publications and publications that you have to pay for. And for me, I think one of the good things that have come out of the closure of Bauer and out of the sort of turmoil of the media industry in general during COVID is that a lot of people have, as an audience, realized that, there might be this turn back to you having to pay for things that you want to see exist, and that not everything can be free and exist forever. And if you don't support things, they will disappear. So I think there is going to be this shift in the near future. I mean, it's happening already that, you see it with, maybe something we could talk about is, Substack, for example, or that kind of thing where you are, kind of personal, predominantly personal brands, and people are subscribing to the works of one person, So I think the direction is that's heading in is that this sort of early internet era where everything is free, everything is available, which, we've obviously, all of us have struggled to find out how you can pay for things to be made when everything is free and everything's available. That seems to be shifting much more into this thing where, people are realizing that certain things will be, for certain things to be made, certain things cost money, and they're going to have to pay for things to see them in the world. So I think where we're heading is that kind of, you're either going to be, mean a lot to a small amount of people and therefore they're going to want to pay for it, or you're going to be huge and like Netflix and feel indispensable and therefore people are going to pay for it. But I do think, and I think maybe we'll talk more about funding, etc. But that seems to me is where things are going. That just hyper niche and hyper broad and very little in between. Movies are either going to be superhero movies or things shot on phones. Basically.
And Jeremy, did you want to...
The publishing equivalent,
Yeah. Jeremy, did you want to weigh in on that question as well?
I think it's just a thing of innovation. I think humanity as a whole has met with, we're all old enough, we've gone through the age now where apps are undermining traditional businesses. So the whole sort of capitalist model that we all were sort of told to entrust in, and especially in the last 6 to 8 months, has proven it's very fallible. And we're all now faced with new systems to how we make things survive. So I think publishing is... I always had a belief that magazines would be free and they'd be supported by obviously wealthy companies and things. So I always had a kind of attitude. I used to call it Robin Hooding. It was kind of stealing from the rich to help the poor, which is mainly the creatives, as we know. And that was how I've always approached it. But the days of when I was young, and I can say that now, when I used to go into newsstands and see all these beautiful glossy magazines, over the years I've watched it thin out. But I also have seen this amazing rise of free publications finding ways and alternative means of funding, which is, to me, is an exciting new innovation. That's what it is to me. That's how I try to... Maybe I'm being over-optimistic, but that's how I like to see it. Yeah.
And you jumped from a publication you had to pay for, Vault magazine, to launching Reflector, which is free. Obviously we've spoken to this before, but I'm wondering, what the difference, or how does it feel like now? Do you feel like you have more freedom editorially, or, yeah?
So when I started Vault, I understood that... to be honest, in Vault, it was a very interesting relationship. I always had a very much socialistic view to publishing, while my business partner had a very capitalist view, which is understandable. I don't have any problems with that. I know some people, that's how they see the world. But I always sort of envisaged the idea when I had Vault that I would build up enough capital and innovation around it to become a free publication, and it would be supported by advertising. But, I decided to step away and start a new thing. So
Start afresh.
Yes.
Katie, did you want to weigh in on the futures of publishing question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can only really speak to what I know of art publishing and working with publishers as a book designer. But it seems to me that books are more important than ever. And I think there's been a universal appreciation for getting offline and reading printed matter kind of in any form, whatever that might be, whether it's books or magazines. I'm kind of interested in the idea of the book as an object being quite a political disruption. You know, nowadays when you browse online, your paths of what you find is so guided by analytics. You know, you're taken on a journey around what your internet history tells you that you want to see. And I think the fact that the book is a tangible object, or the magazine is a tangible object, has it's found a new place as being quite disruptive, because you're probably more likely to find something outside of your usual frames of reference at a bookstore than you are kind of in your bookmark web pages, your multiple tabs you have open. And I think that's kind of interesting, you know. They talk about how printed matter can be used as a political disruptor, and I think potentially that could be a new future for publishing in the printed space anyway.
Yeah. I think, Steve, when I first discovered this, when I first moved to Melbourne, what I love about it, especially this issue that you did, I think this is all through Skypes and Zooms.
Yeah, that's the COVID issue, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it really brought, people that may be hard to read if you're not within sort of the bubble of, arts and sort of design discourses, really, down to earth. So, yeah, that was kind of my takeaway of the publication. And yeah, I was wondering about your take on kind of the future of publishing then.
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on that point, it is the publications are about accessibility. So it's about people being able to, they're pretty complicated ideas. You've got, people like Saskia Sussen, whose books are incredible, but they are very dense. And people like, Jack Self, who speaks in a very particular way, or Brooke Holmes, and, and even the local perspective. So the point of the conversation is to make them accessible, because it takes out the structure of an auditorium or a lecture theatre, and it makes it a lot easier. And that's why we're having them on street corners. And to the point of the future of publishing, I have no idea. I'm a landscape architect, and I've put out 3 books in my entire life, so I'm probably not the best person to ask about that. I mean, I think we did decide to put books out, and it shows that people, we care enough to do it. And I think the response to our publications, which is all I can speak about, to be honest, has been really amazing and far what we thought was going to happen. So I think the act of buying a book and having a physical object is still really important. And I think that's been probably amplified over the last year, and people realise that physical experience and digital experience, they do different things in different ways. And I think the act of sort of stumbling across something in a bookshop is a great thing, as you mentioned. I don't think it's...
And if you had $1 million, if I gave you $1 million tomorrow, would you continue to make the books? Yeah.
Will we put out books? I don't know. I think if we had something to say, if it was something interesting, yeah.
I just think I'm trying to wrestle you into producing more, because I think that they occupy a really important sort of gap in the market at the moment with relation to
it's more time than money, to be honest, is the issue. Yeah. So there's 2 of us putting out these publications. So it's more related to that than not having the cash to do it at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. I think that I might open up to the audience now then, if there's any questions. Anyone has any questions? Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear your ideas about the role of an editor.
Is that particularly to...
Well, you're all publishing. I'd like to know the editorial process.
Yeah. Of a specific publication, or... Okay, yeah, sure. Katie, did you want to speak to that? Could you hear that question?
I couldn't hear the question, sorry.
The question was about the role of the editor. What is the role of the editor in making a publication?
Well, as I've said before, I feel like a bit of an imposter editor. So I can only speak to a graphic designer pretending to be an editor. But I think editors all have their own sort of approach to what they do. With me, I'm a very hands-off editor. I kind of like to think about the book as being a group show in a gallery, because I do these kind of anthologies, lots of contributors. And I kind of like to think about it as, the book is a space, is a white space, and I'm bringing in people's work for them to be able to say what they want to say. And that's how I kind of approach my role as an editor, as kind of like a curator, as a curator would in a group show.
Great.
But I don't know if that's right.
Great. And
maybe Henry can tell me what the role of the editor should be.
Henry, did you want to answer that as the sort of bona fide editor of the group?
Well, I mean, I think there's, part of it is that it's a sort of assemblage. It's driving the sort of overall themes and stories of the title of the issue. And then, so there's that curatorial aspect. There's certainly a large kind of administrative aspect. And then I think just a really important thing is just trying to get the best work out of people. And then once you get what you can try and get the best work out of people, is try and make that work as good as possible, and that is work with, and that's working with the writer, with the photographer, with the illustrator, whoever. And, for me, it's giving them feedback, and hopefully I'm pushing them, they're pushing me, and together we're making something that's better than the sum of its parts, And I think that's what you want to do as an editor, is make the thing better than the sum of its parts.
Jeremy, did you want to answer that question?
Well, when I started Vault magazine, I managed to find some very generous people with time. Time is currency, and I always had editors with Vault magazine. But as I changed over to Reflector magazine, I had a panel of contributors, be artists, writers. Some of them have been editors in other European publications, overseas, Vogue, things like that. So I got a group of people together to put all their ideas. I like the idea of saying, try and get the best out of everyone. That's what I always say. Just people just do their best, come up with some innovative, interesting ideas. And then, as you'd say, I used to call it a Clayton's editor. I wasn't very good at it, but I used to sit there with the assistance of my designers and my business partner, and we'd sit there and select ideas, and then it was just a sort of bouncing back and forward process. I think the idea, I would love an editor, but I really can't afford it when I'm already publishing something that's free. So I have to be one of those miserable jack of all trades kind of people, which I know lots of editors would say. Lots of editors have said to me, "You're not an editor," and I said, "I completely agree." So, yeah.
I guess you would say the same.
Yeah, I definitely agree with it. I'm definitely not an editor at all. So Simon and I do the edits, and then we have an editor who's one of our friends who's also an architect, so not an editor. He does a round of edits, and then we do it, and then we send it to the speakers to then sort of, I guess, approve anything that they might not have been okay saying. So definitely not a traditional process, and probably a very inefficient one, but that's because we don't know what we're doing. So yeah, so it goes through a few more sets of hands than it probably would if you had an editor on board, but our time's cheap. So, yeah.
And I think the funny thing about this discussion really is that we're all imposters in the publishing world, and we all have backgrounds in design and architecture, and we're all kind of mostly making it up as we go along, although I would hate to put you in that realm, Oliver, because you're very experienced. But yeah, we kind of all sort of fell into it, and I guess it's like a general kind of love of words and publishing, but also in all of the magazines, or why I wanted to bring these amazing people today together was just like an intention to making sure that there's like a diversity of voices within a publication, and making sure that there's like a really clear kind of cross-section, I guess, of society that is enabled to have a voice, I guess, in print. And that's my focus, I guess, as an editor of Assembled Papers, and then also the accessibility of language in the design realm as well, and wanting to make sure that ideas around the built environment are able to be digested and can enable also like a sort of feedback loop, I guess. So somebody can read something that's published in Assembled Papers and we can have a conversation about it. I'm also not an editor, and I send everything that I edit to my mother to read before I publish it. And yeah, so it's somewhat a family affair, and Jeremy and I were discussing that the other day as well. Like, if I know that it's understandable if my very intelligent but wonderful mother can understand it, basically. Yeah. Okay, is there any more questions?
I feel I'm hogging the questions. Often driven by passion, the ideas are the fun part. Then once you've got the land, book or magazine, you've got the distribution.
Yeah.
How do you handle that?
Did you want to take that?
Okay, so going back to Volt magazine, distribution was filling up a car with magazines and basically begging people to take it. But with the publication Reflector, it's distributed through fairly simple places, cafes, art schools, I guess, and most people that we've come across in the team, they actually love it because it's a free thing. People really enjoy it, and most people are quite excited to see it, and most people have been accommodating. So the traditional distribution method, which was, say, paying a company like, you guys have probably heard of companies like Gordon and Gotch, which work on point of sale. You pay them to deliver the magazines. They put the magazine on a newsstand. As soon as the magazine sells, they take a percentage of the sale. So, which seems pretty simple, but when you actually get into the sort of sad thing of crunching numbers and percentages of, when you're paying editors and production costs, and then you're having to give distributors money as well, your profit margins are getting absolutely minuscule, even though you might be charging $15, $20 for the magazine. Hence why I said, can make it free, and then I'm not constrained by newsstands. I want it to be removed from the whole newsstand. The only thing I ever wished to be in was airports. I always loved the idea. As a magazine publisher...
That's what we want as well.
You looked at all those people in the airport looking at magazines, and it was kind of like... Yeah. It was like the kind of holy grail.
It's like the Kerr of publishing, yeah. And now it's all over. So I guess we're kind of, well, for me, I'm also kind of like, a fish out of water with distribution at the moment. It's been a hard moment for distributing a free magazine during the pandemic. But yeah, did you want to say something to distribution, Katie or Oliver? Katie, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. We have a very DIY approach to distribution here in New Zealand. So when I first started publishing books with Gloria, we didn't have anywhere to sell them. There weren't very many art book stores in New Zealand. We don't have an art book fair regularly, and we were kind of at a bit of a loss where to sell them. So we just started an art book fair. We just decided to have one in our space, and that went really well. And so we were like, well, okay, we need something a bit more permanent. So we started an art bookstore. So we have an art bookstore out the front of our studio space, which has kind of local titles and a few books by Perimeter come over. And then kind of, each year we seem to sort of start something new to help get our books further and further out there. So last year's project was we collectivized with a few other art book publishers to create a distribution collective to get our books into bookstores. It's called Expensive Hobby. Some people like to kayak and spend heaps of money on paddles, and we like to make weird books. But we've collectivized, and so that the bookstores only have to order now from one place, and they can access, at the moment, I think it's 4 or 5 different art book publishers, but that's going to eventually grow to be more. So it makes it easier for them to stock our books in bookstores around New Zealand. So I think collectivizing is a good idea. It's worked really well so far. And building your own space, building your spaces if you can.
Great. Is there any more questions?
Yeah, I had one, which is, I guess, from listening to Simon and Steve that are here, or knowing them, and you said you're doing like one more publication, and I was interested in the idea from everybody about like the idea of a limited edition or a one-off as opposed to trying to sustain something. And I can kind of, like, sitting here thinking about it, think about pros and cons to both situations. I wonder if, I'm just interested to hear more about that, of what's easier or what the pitfalls are to both.
I think that with the approach of trying to make it as cheap as we can means that we can't pay, an editor to be full-time doing everything. Like if, it would have to be, we came in with this as being a discrete project that we're going to do that's going to put out these specific talks and make it this neat, project in itself. I think you'd have to just set up a different model to make it sort of, so we're really glad that it's going to end in this nice way, and it's not going to peter out because we don't have the resources or the energy to sort of keep going with it. I think it's just being like honest with yourself about what you can achieve as well, especially when like this is a very DIY thing. Like, we are doing absolutely everything, like editing, graphic design. One of our friends does the copy editing, and we have just like a contra agreement with her to do it, and she gets a free desk in our studio, and it's absolutely just trying to work it out as we go. Whereas I think for a sustaining thing, like a lot of the other people have, you need to put a bit more thought into it than maybe we do with things that we do. We sort of just try it and see what works, and that's sort of our approach.
And I know, I know that maybe Henry, you wanted to jump on there, because I know that Essential Services Zine is going to stop soon, or is kind of a limited edition in itself.
Yeah, well, I guess from the initial kind of idea was just to do one, see how it went. I did one, loved doing it, I've got a great response. So through that, I kind of thought I'll do 2 at a time. So I got funding to do 2 more issues, and then thought I'd reevaluate that. So that basically that meant that all I had to do was do a budget for 2 issues. I didn't have to budget, I didn't have to do a business plan for what it would look like as an ongoing concern, which is in high contrast with Metro. I mean, to sort of complete the sort of narrative around that is that, someone I know, but ended up buying the title from Bauer. And so now, I'm now co-owner of Metro. It's co-owned by 5 people who are all involved in making it. So it's kind of both a sort of commercial entity and a sort of collective in a way. And that's entirely different, that's my job, as well as, I love doing it, but it's also my job. And the pressure there is like that is and needs to be a sustainable thing. I mean, that is ongoing. I mean, it has been publishing since 1981, and we're just kind of like the latest iteration of it. So that's definitely something that I hope outlives me, or outlives my editorship for sure. I want to be a kind of custodian of it, and I want to make the best Metro that I can, and then allow someone else to do the same after me. So I really want it to be sustainable, both commercially and creatively, for as long as possible.
I don't know if that answers that question really, but I would say
what's easier? Easier is just doing a limited run. It's really easy because you just there's no you don't have to do a business plan. You don't have to make sure you're covering people's salaries. All that stuff you don't feel the pressure. You can do it on the back of a napkin. No problem.
Yeah, and I think on that's how we see it, is like the way we would see it if it was an architecture project or a landscape architecture project. It's like it's its own, thing that exists as a project within our office. It's not, we're not going to start publishing a bunch of other books. It's like we did this thing, now we're going to publish this thing. And we just view it the way we view other projects. So that's why it's sort of this. It ends, it's rather than being like, oh, this is going to be our new career, or we're going to do this for the next 10 years or anything like that. It's like, because I think that's how our professions are set up. It's like you do a project and then you do a new project and it's constantly a new thing, rather than continually, putting out a publication. They just sort of, I think it's different professions look at things in different ways. So maybe that's why we're doing it too.
Yeah, I think that like the design, I don't know, I used to have a journal called Fictional Journal, and we kind of dove into it out of like a sort of passionate kind of post-master's project that we thought would last forever. But then, of course, things change, people move country, and I don't know, have some children or whatever. And, that in the end, we had to give it over to a cultural institution who's now going to run it for us and continue the work that we started. But yeah, I think had we known earlier on that it was a good idea to have a finishing point to something, it would have been probably quite beneficial for everyone involved. So I guess the answer is limited editions are quite good. Yeah. Yeah.
Whether it's a magazine or like a physical space, it seems to be very much the same.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. With these, I mean, Assemble Papers has been going for 8 or 9 years now, I think. No one really knows. It's kind of like who started the blog, no one knows. But and I guess I guess I look at Assemble Papers really as like a long-term project. Maybe it'll hit the sort of 15-year mark, and then we'll see what happens.
And I think maybe to like artist-run spaces, like there's only so much passion and DIY energy can go into it before it's like it either needs to stop or it becomes something maybe more formal as well. So maybe that's the similar sort of parallels, is like there's only so much free time you can throw into something, or sweat equity isn't equity. So it doesn't get you. There's only so far it can go, and then maybe it needs to end or be a more formal institution, which I think probably happens quite a lot.
Okay, cool. If there's no further questions, I think we'll just leave it there. It's a good moment to end, I think. So thank you so much. That was really great. And thank you to everyone on screen.